On January 26, 2013, a 21-year-old student from Vancouver arrived in Los Angeles. Within days, she checked into a downtown hotel that looked like any other to a traveler. But the hotel she chose was not ordinary. It was the Cecil, a building with a reputation tied to murders, suicides, and even serial killers who once lived there. Viewer discretion advised. This story contains unsettling details. If you're drawn to dark, true crime mysteries, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Her stay began like a normal trip, but it would soon unravel in ways no one could have predicted. For Elisa Lam, Los Angeles was just another stop on a longer trip she'd been planning for months. She had already visited San Diego and talked online about wanting to see more of the California coast before heading to San Francisco. When she reached Los Angeles on January 26, 2013, she seemed like any other young traveler. A backpack, a loose itinerary, and plenty of curiosity. 2 days later, she checked into the Cecil Hotel downtown, a place that offered budget accommodations for tourists, while also sharing space with long-term residents from the surrounding Skid Row area. From the outside, it looked like a convenient stop in the middle of the city. But its history of tragedy gave it a reputation most visitors wouldn't learn until later. Her early days in Los Angeles were filled with the kinds of activities you'd expect from someone exploring a new city. Elisa loved bookstores and made her way to the Last Bookstore, one of the most iconic shops in the area. She browsed, bought gifts for her family, and even chatted with the manager, who later remembered her as outgoing and lively. On her blog, she wrote about the small things she noticed when wandering new places, and her posts painted a picture of someone enjoying her independence. To her parents back in Vancouver, she was still in touch every day, checking in regularly to reassure them she was safe. Nothing about her movements suggested what was about to happen. At the hotel, Elisa's stay started uneventfully, but soon took a strange turn. She was first placed in a shared room on the 5th floor, but the arrangement didn't last long. Within 2 days, after other guests complained about her behavior, the hotel assigned her a private room instead. Staff later explained that she had been disruptive, leaving notes on her roommates' beds and locking the door behind them. It wasn't violent, but it was unusual enough for the hotel to act quickly. Alone in her own room, Elisa was still just another guest on the register. But that detail now stands out as the first sign that something about her stay was different. Outside the hotel, Elisa kept exploring Los Angeles like any other visitor. On January 31st, the day she was scheduled to check out and travel north to Santa Cruz, she was seen again at the Last Bookstore. Employees there remembered her fondly, talking about how she laughed and carefully picked souvenirs for her family back home. That would be the final, confirmed sighting of her. Later that day, she stopped making her regular calls to her parents, breaking the daily pattern that had been in place since her trip began. By nightfall, she was no longer answering messages. Looking back at these last days, her movements appear ordinary. Walking through bookstores, talking with shopkeepers, returning to her hotel at night. Yet, inside the Cecil, her stay joined the list of unsettling stories the building had already collected for decades. Suicide attempts, violent crimes, and residents whose names became linked to Los Angeles' darkest chapters all cast long shadows over the rooms she walked past. For someone visiting on a short trip, none of that history would have been obvious. It simply meant her disappearance became one more unexplained event tied to a building already known for them. All of this leaves a clear, if unsettling, timeline. Elisa arrived in Los Angeles on January 26th. She checked into the Cecil 2 days later. She stayed in contact with family until January 31st, the day she was last seen alive. After that, her presence vanished from both her hotel and the city. Those who had spoken with her that week described her as cheerful, social, and thoughtful, making her sudden silence all the more difficult to understand. The next part of her story doesn't come from blog posts, bookstore visits, or conversations with strangers. It comes from a camera inside the Cecil Hotel itself. A brief piece of security footage would soon take center stage, because once you've seen it, you don't forget it. Elisa's disappearance quickly turned from quiet concern into an urgent case. After she stopped contacting her family on January 31st, her parents reported her missing, and the LAPD began searching the Cecil Hotel. Officers went through her room, combed the hallways, and checked security logs. They brought in scent-tracking dogs that even explored the rooftop, though nothing pointed to her location. Without probable cause, they couldn't open every private room in the building, and the investigation stalled with no trail to follow. A week later, on February 6th, police circulated missing person flyers with Elisa's photo around downtown Los Angeles and online. Still, no one came forward with new information. Then, investigators tried something different. They turned to security footage. The clip they released came from one of the hotel's elevators. It had been recorded on January 31st, Elisa's last known day, and uploaded by the LAPD on February 13th. Police hoped someone would recognize her clothes or recall seeing her that evening. Instead, the 2.5-minute video became the focal point of the entire case. The footage seemed ordinary at first, then unsettling. Elisa steps into the elevator. She leans forward and presses an entire column of buttons, touching nearly every floor. The doors stay open, eerily unresponsive. She peeks out into the hallway, then darts back inside. Was she checking to see if someone followed her? Moments later, she presses herself into a corner, hiding from view as though someone is just outside the door. She slides cautiously to the threshold, then tiptoes out of frame before re-entering seconds later. Was she testing if it was safe to leave? Her gestures then grow stranger. She steps fully out into the hallway again, arms shifting in broad, deliberate motions. Her hands writhe against the air as if she's signaling or warding something away. Was she communicating? Performing some routine? Talking to someone who never appears on camera? Throughout all of this, the elevator refuses to close. For many viewers, that detail became its own mystery. Some suggested the door hold button could have been pressed, which stalls elevators for minutes at a time. Others thought someone outside the camera's frame was interfering. Elevator technicians debated the point for years, but never reached consensus. When the video went public, it exploded across the internet. Within days, it drew millions of views, not just in North America, but globally, even trending on Chinese video platforms. Forums filled with frame-by-frame dissections. To some, her movements reflected pure fear, the behavior of someone fleeing a pursuer. To others, it looked unmistakably like a psychotic episode linked to her bipolar disorder. A third camp pushed theories that stretched into the paranormal. Speculation had no limits. drugs, possession, games gone wrong. Every idea surfaced. But one detail would later cut through certain guesses. Her toxicology report found no illicit drugs in her system. Only traces of prescribed medication appeared, though not all at the expected levels if she was consistently taking them. That line of evidence would come later, but it made clear that the wilder theories wouldn't hold. Another recurring claim centered on the video itself. Amateur analysts noticed the timestamp was obscured and pointed out the odd pacing, arguing that up to a minute might be missing. Some accused the hotel or police of withholding information, but officials and hotel staff denied altering the footage before release, insisting it matched what existed on record. The public kept debating, but nothing definitive ever proved manipulation. What stuck most with viewers was the unanswered question. What exactly was happening in that hallway, just beyond the edge of the frame the camera couldn't capture? The more people studied the footage, the less sense it seemed to make. It suggested danger, illness, or something entirely different, but never confirmed a single explanation. Meanwhile, police were no closer to finding Elisa. The video generated worldwide attention, but no verified leads. Her parents remained in limbo. Guests continued to check in and out of the Cecil, walking past news vans, and reporters camped at the doors. The elevator footage became the case itself, the last confirmed evidence of Elisa Lam alive. And then, nearly 3 weeks after she vanished, a discovery would shift everything, raising questions far beyond the strange scene caught on camera. On February 19th, 2013, hotel maintenance worker Santiago Lopez climbed to the roof of the Cecil Hotel to investigate guest complaints. People had been reporting low water pressure, discolored taps, and even a strange taste when they brushed their teeth or made their morning coffee. Lopez went up to inspect the large rooftop tanks that supplied the building with water. When he opened the hatch of one, he found Elisa Lam's body floating just beneath the surface. Her clothing, the same outfit seen in the elevator video, along with her watch and room key, rested at the bottom of the tank. The discovery immediately shifted the case. Initial media reports caused confusion because some outlets stated the hatch was closed when she was found. But Santiago Lopez, the man who discovered her, clarified later that the hatch was open. This single point remains important in the timeline because it made clear she could not have secured the lid herself from inside. Elisa had been missing since January 31st. Her body remained in the water for nearly 3 weeks before anyone found her. By the time of recovery, decomposition was already visible, making identification even more haunting. News spread quickly, not only because of the tragedy, but because guests had been drinking and bathing in the hotel's contaminated water supply during that time. For many, the shock of that detail brought international attention to a mystery that had already gripped the internet. Removing her from the tank was not a simple matter. Each of the cylindrical containers was about 4 by 8 feet, sitting on concrete blocks with no easy entry points. Workers first drained the tank before cutting into its side to recover her remains. Reporters and photographers camped outside the Cecil as crews carried out the grim operation. For the families staying in the hotel that week, what began as a plumbing complaint turned into something out of a nightmare. When the Los Angeles County Coroner released its findings, the official story became clear on paper. Elisa Lam's death was ruled an accidental drowning, with her bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. Toxicology results showed prescription medications in her system, but at lower levels than expected if she'd been taking them regularly. Notably, no illicit drugs were detected, only trace alcohol. For investigators, that combination suggested she may have been under-medicated in the days leading to her death, possibly explaining the erratic behavior in the elevator footage. Still, the setting of her death left investigators and the public unsettled. Roof access at the Cecil was supposed to be restricted. Doors leading to the top floor had locks and alarms designed to prevent intruders. Yet police search dogs reported losing her scent near a window that connected to a fire escape. Later, photos and videos posted online showed that the roof could be reached without triggering alarms if someone used the exterior fire escape. On the roof itself, the 4 tanks sat side by side, and while their lids were heavy, some were known not to be properly secured. These details kept the question open. Could Elisa have realistically reached the tank alone, or did someone help her? That uncertainty deepened when people considered the sequence of steps required. Climbing the fire escape, crossing the rooftop, using a ladder to reach the tank, lifting its lid, and then getting inside. Each of those actions was possible. But together, they painted a highly unusual scenario for a person acting alone. And once inside, the chance of escape would have been slim. The slick walls and elevated placement made climbing out nearly impossible without external help. The contradictions fed doubt. If this was an accident connected to her mental health, why did the circumstances of access seem so irregular? If it was something else, why was there no evidence of assault, trauma, or restraint? The autopsy gave one version of events, but the physical environment suggested another. Both were technically plausible, which left friends, family, and the public without full clarity. In the wake of the discovery, Elisa's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the hotel, arguing that rooftop hazards should have been secured against foreseeable risks. The court, however, ruled in favor of the hotel, stating that management could not reasonably expect a guest to access the tanks. By then, the case had already become international news, cementing the Cecil Hotel's reputation as a place where the ordinary always seemed to tilt into the impossible. The rooftop discovery confirmed what everyone feared, but resolved little of what puzzled investigators. A body was found. A cause of death was listed. Yet the path that led Elisa Lam from an elevator on January 31st to a water tank nearly 3 weeks later could not be fully explained. And it's in that uneasy space between official findings and unanswered questions that her story continues to disturb. The coroner ultimately ruled Elisa Lam's death an accidental drowning, with bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor in the final report released in June 2013. That is the official conclusion, but it never quieted the questions that followed. Experts and investigators weighed 3 credible possibilities: a psychotic episode linked to missed medication, a tragic misadventure on the hotel roof, or foul play. The autopsy, however, found no evidence of sexual assault, and toxicology showed no recreational drugs. Those results pushed back against many darker theories, though they couldn't explain every gap in her final movements. So where does that leave the story? In your view, was this a case of mental health, a preventable accident, or something more sinister? Leave your best supported theory in the comments below, and subscribe if you want more methodical, skeptical breakdowns of true crime mysteries. The facts leave gaps, And in those gaps, Elisa's family still waits for answers. Two men are found dead on a quiet hillside in Brazil, dressed in formal suits, raincoats, and strange handmade lead masks covering their eyes. The date was August 20th, 1966. The place, Vintém Hill, Niterói, just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. No blood, no struggle, cash still in their pockets. Beside them lay a cryptic notebook with chilling instructions about capsules, signals, and masks. Who were they waiting for? And why did it cost them their lives? This is where the mystery begins. On that hillside, in silence, with details that defied all common sense. What came next was the discovery itself. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, an 18-year-old named Jorge da Costa Alves was flying his kite on Vintém Hill when he came across a scene that stopped him cold. There, in the grass, two men lay side by side in their suits and raincoats. At first, they might have looked like they were only resting, but the crude lead masks strapped over their faces made it very clear something was wrong. Alves immediately told local authorities, but the hill's steep and rough terrain made it nearly impossible for police and firefighters to reach the site that same day. The bodies remained where they were through the night, exposed to the elements and to whoever else might have stumbled across them. Investigators didn't make it up until the following day, a delay that many later argued seriously compromised the forensic investigation. When officers finally arrived, they found details that only raised more questions. The men were lying atop cut palm leaves, pindabá leaves, suggesting someone had deliberately prepared the spot. Their heads and torsos were partially covered by tall grass, as if they had been hidden or shielded before they were discovered. There were faint but noticeable traces of blood at the nose and mouth of both victims. It wasn't enough to claim violence outright, but it complicated the idea that this was simply a natural or unexplained death. Around the bodies were a handful of ordinary items that stood out for how deliberate they seemed. An empty water bottle, 2 damp towels, and a small leather notebook. Taken together, these objects pointed toward a planned event. Even stranger, police found their wallets still inside their clothes. One man carried 157,000 Colombian pesos, while the other had 4,000 Colombian pesos on him. Roughly 161,000 Colombian pesos total, completely untouched. Whatever happened, it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The lead masks, however, were the most bewildering part of the scene. Made from sheets of metal cut and bent by hand, they looked like sunglasses without openings, pressed close against the men's eyes. They would have blinded anyone wearing them. Some believed the masks were meant to shield their vision from radiation or bright lights. Others whispered about rituals or experimental practices. Whatever the explanation, it was impossible to ignore that the masks transformed the discovery from unusual to unearthly. Despite all of these strange clues, the bodies showed no external wounds. Their clothing, though dusty, was intact. No rips, no stains of blood beyond the faint traces on their faces. The ground around them wasn't disturbed. No drag marks, no signs of a struggle. But declaring the scene entirely clean would be misleading, because the investigation itself had severe gaps. A knife used to cut the palm leaves, for example, was never found. Autopsies later faced heavy criticism for being incomplete and poorly timed, leaving crucial questions about toxicology and cause of death unanswered. Investigators tried at first, to fit the scene into a common framework. Two men dead in a remote area could point to murder for money. But the untouched cash and tickets shattered that theory. It was also plain they had traveled with the expectations of returning. Their receipts, clothing, and bus tickets all signaled preparation for a round-trip trip, not the end of a journey. Nothing about the arrangement suggested chaos or improvisation, which made matters worse. In fact, it was the quiet order of the scene that disturbed onlookers most. The towels laid out, the leaves, the way the men lay side by side, the symmetry created by their identical attire. All of it leaned towards something ritualistic, whether by design or not. It didn't look random. It didn't look accidental. It looked like the careful staging of two men who had prepared for a specific purpose. From the very start, the discovery confounded investigators. There was no weapon, no clear cause of death, no evidence of theft, and no indication that either man had stumbled into the situation unknowingly. The case resisted every ordinary explanation, which left a more unsettling question hanging in the air. If the scene itself could not explain their deaths, then the explanation had to lie in who these men were before they climbed that hillside. The two figures found on Vintem Hill were soon identified, and their names gave the mystery a face. They were Manuel Pereira de Cruz, about 32 years old, and Miguel Jose Viana, about 34. Both electronics technicians from the city of Campos dos Goitacazes, northeast of Rio de Janeiro. Far from being unknown drifters, they were respected in their community for their skill in repairing televisions, radios, and other devices. Friends and family remembered them as dependable, ordinary men who worked steady jobs. That's why the news of their strange deaths was so hard to reconcile with the lives people thought they knew. But beneath the routine of fixing circuits and soldering wires was another side to Manuel and Miguel. They were not only technicians, they were seekers of the unexplained. Accounts from acquaintances and police records revealed their involvement in what was sometimes referred to as a scientific spiritualist circle. They investigated UFO sightings reported in Brazilian newspapers during the 1960s and studied writings about spiritualist phenomena. Searches of their homes later turned up esoteric books, including volumes that speculated about life on Mars, alongside notebooks filled with calculations of Ohm's law and valve codes. Technical notes that highlighted how seamlessly they blended scientific precision with mystical pursuits. For them, electronics and the paranormal were not separate worlds, but overlapping ones, connected through signals, frequencies, and the possibility of contacting something beyond ordinary human experience. In the last days of their lives, the two men began preparations that now read like steps toward a carefully organized mission. Friends later recalled them mentioning an important, undisclosed appointment. On August 17, 1966, they left Campos for Niterói, where they began their final journey. Along the way, they made specific purchases: 2 raincoats from a local shop and a bottle of mineral water from a bar. According to a waitress who served them there, Miguel appeared very tense, kept checking his watch, and seemed eager to leave. The raincoats suggested they expected to be exposed to the outdoors, while the water bottle, and more curiously, the fact that they held onto the receipt, indicated they still expected to return and settle accounts. Nothing about their behavior suggested they believed they were heading toward the last day of their lives. All of this might have looked like coincidence, if not for the item investigators found lying beside their bodies: a brown notebook. Inside its pages were sparse notes that investigators described more like instructions than diary entries. One peculiar line became the centerpiece of the case: 1630 B at the specified place. 1830 ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals, await signal mask. This was translated from Portuguese exactly as it appeared, without punctuation. That lack of clarity made its meaning even harder to pin down. Was it ingest capsules after the effect, implying 2 steps? Or ingest capsules after the effect, with a different sequence altogether? Each reading shifted the possible intent, and investigators had no way to know which interpretation the men followed. The phrases only added to the sense of organized intent. Protect metals. What metals? Their watches? Equipment? Or was it symbolic? Await signal mask. Was this a literal radio signal? The expectation of a paranormal communication, or something else entirely? For outsiders, the writing seemed like fragments of ritual. But given Miguel and Manuel's technical expertise, it was just as possible these were procedural notes for an experiment. What mattered most was not the answer, but the evidence of careful timing and deliberate steps, which showed they were carrying out a plan. When investigators searched their homes, the details dug up only reinforced that impression. Books about UFOs and spiritual contact lined their shelves. Notes with sketches and equations filled their work notebooks. The picture that emerged was not of reckless hobbyists, but of men sincerely trying to chart out contact with phenomena they believed existed. Whether they expected a celestial visitor, a paranormal manifestation, or simply to test a theory, they prepared as if anticipating something real, something scheduled, and something worth committing their lives to. Even the masks, made by hand, from sheets of lead, began to take on a different weight once placed in this context. Perhaps they were meant to shield vision from harmful flashes, or to prevent damage from radiation during whatever they anticipated. Whatever the purpose, the creation and use of these masks showed intent rather than randomness. They weren't scavenged items, but objects designed for a task only Manuel and Miguel understood. Taken together, the receipts in their pockets, the instructions in the notebook, the raincoats, and the bottles. These were the tools of deliberate action. They were not men who fell prey to random violence on an isolated hilltop. They were men who followed a plan to its mysterious conclusion. What makes the story endure is the sense of order within chaos, specific intentions, layered preparations, and yet no clear understanding of why it all ended as it did. Investigators now had names, a background, a timeline, a notebook, and every indication that a planned event had taken place. But instead of giving clarity, all of these details only deepened the uncertainty of the case. Investigators soon faced the grim reality that this was shaping into a case without answers. They had the bodies, the belongings, and even that notebook of strange instructions. Yet, every attempt to move the case forward seemed to collapse under its own problems. From the beginning, the handling of the autopsies crippled the investigation. When the bodies were first discovered, officials delayed transferring them for examination because the coroner's office was overwhelmed. By the time autopsies were finally performed weeks later, advanced decomposition had set in. Their internal organs were too badly deteriorated for proper toxicological testing. To make matters worse, the work wasn't handled by an experienced coroner, but by an assistant, who confirmed there was no visible trauma and no obvious signs of poisoning. But crucially, no chemical analysis was ever done. In a situation where toxicology could have made the difference, that opportunity was lost before it even began. Almost a year later, there was one final chance. Under pressure, the Justice Department ordered the bodies exhumed. But instead of clarity, the effort destroyed the last remaining hope of answers. In an attempt to preserve the remains, far too much formaldehyde was pumped into them. The tissues were saturated to the point of being useless for testing. One of the doctors involved later admitted that no accurate toxicology could be performed after that mistake. At that moment, authorities shut the door on the only path that might have revealed the cause of death. And even before exhumation, a key clue had already raised difficult questions: the note in the notebook. In plain words, it instructed the men to ingest capsules. That single detail could have explained everything. A deliberate poisoning, an accidental overdose, or perhaps a chemical meant to alter perception. But no capsules were ever recovered. Not on the ground, not in their clothing, nowhere. And because autopsies were never supported by proper toxicology, police could never confirm whether those capsules had even been taken. The absence of evidence left investigators stuck between two realities. They had clear instructions pointing to ingestion, but nothing to prove it actually happened. With hard science out of reach, what followed were competing theories. Some investigators suggested a ritualized suicide pact, but this clashed with the evidence. These men carried cash, bus tickets, receipts, items you don't keep if you're planning to leave no return. Others argued it might have been an experiment gone wrong. As technicians fascinated with energy and radio signals, perhaps they believed an ingested chemical could amplify their senses, allowing them to detect a signal from another realm. That idea was easier to tie to their masks, which seemed designed to block radiation or harsh light. But it was speculation all the same. The case even drew in the Brazilian military. The Army, Navy, and Air Force Secret Service each carried out their own checks, curious if the deaths were linked to clandestine operations. At the time, Cold War espionage was not a far-fetched concern. Cruz and Viana's knowledge of electronics, the remote vantage point of Vintem Hill, and their cryptic notes all raised suspicions about secret radio transmissions. Authorities even looked into whether their activities were tied to a mysterious explosion at a nearby beach months earlier. But despite military involvement, no link to espionage or intelligence operations was ever proven. Then came the reports of lights in the sky. Several witnesses claimed that on the night the men were on the hill, an oval-shaped object glowed above it, ringed in fire and casting blue rays downward. One particularly detailed account came from a woman named Gracinda Barbosa Coutinho, who reported seeing the object with her children. To locals aware of Cruz and Viana's interest in UFOs, this detail slid neatly into a possible narrative: that both men had gone to the hill to meet something from the sky. But there was a problem. Many of those accounts only surfaced after news of the deaths spread widely in the papers. That delay made it difficult to separate genuine sightings from details colored by sensational headlines. Investigators also tried one final angle: testing tiny samples of bone and tissue that had been taken for study at an atomic energy institute. The idea was that if radiation or unusual elements were present, results might still point toward an explanation. But here too, the findings went nowhere. The The reported values were normal, and poor record-keeping about how the samples were stored meant the results carried no real weight. Once again, an avenue of scientific inquiry ended in frustration. Every theory explained a fragment and then fell apart. Suicide did not fit the evidence of returned tickets and money. Cold War espionage could not explain glowing objects in the sky. Alien contact lined up with the men's fascination, but it collapsed under the timing and reliability of the witness reports. Nothing stood without contradiction. And so the investigation circled back to the same point: unfinished, uncertain, and unsolved. The masks, the notes, the money in their pockets, the missing capsules. No matter how the pieces were arranged, the picture never came together. What lingered was not an answer, but the persistence of a mystery. Something that continues to draw people in, not for what was discovered, but for all that still cannot be explained. The lead masks case remains unsettled even after decades. Investigators had clues: the crude masks, the cryptic notebook, the mention of capsules, the ruined toxicology. But none of it pointed to a clear resolution. To make matters worse, many official files and reports on the case later went missing or were destroyed. A failure that made reopening the investigation impossible and fueled even more suspicion. So the question is left to us: suicide, tragic experiment, government operation, or something else? What fits the facts, and what leaves the worst questions unanswered? What was the signal they were waiting for? Drop your thoughts below, and if you're into strange, unresolved mysteries, make sure to subscribe for more. Imagine walking through the woods and stumbling upon an abandoned truck. Inside, there's a wallet and a purse. IDS. A cell phone with a haunting picture of a little girl. And under the seat, $32,000 in cash. The dog was there too, starving but alive. No broken glass, no struggle, just silence. This wasn't a story from the imagination. On October 8, 2009, a family disappeared after leaving their home in Eufaula, Oklahoma. Their truck was found about a week later in the Sans Bois Mountains of Latimer County. Investigators eventually located skeletal remains years later, but the medical examiner could not determine cause of death. What could make a family disappear and leave everything behind? On that October afternoon in 2009, Bobby Jamison, his wife Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison pulled out of their driveway in Eufaula, Oklahoma. Their destination was a remote 40-acre parcel near the community of Red Oak, tucked inside the Sans Bois Mountains. On paper, it looked like a fresh start. They had talked about building a simple home, getting away from the stresses of daily life. Families make trips like this all the time. An afternoon drive, a walk across a plot of land. A bit of dreaming about what life might look like somewhere new. But this drive became their last recorded journey. The Jamisons didn't return home. Days turned into a week with no contact. And then, in mid-October 2009, hunters came across the family's pickup truck, abandoned on a rough dirt track deep in the mountains. It seemed undisturbed, locked, no broken glass, no signs of forced entry. The family was nowhere nearby. When investigators opened the truck, what they saw only deepened the mystery. Inside, the family dog, Maisie, was alive but severely malnourished after days without food or water. On the seats were Bobby and Sherilyn's wallets and IDs, several cell phones, a GPS unit, paper maps, coats, and toys. that Madison had brought along. Beneath one of the seats, officers located an envelope holding about $32,000 in cash. Not a dollar spent, not a pocket emptied. That much money, left behind alongside identification, electronics, and a child's belongings, simply didn't fit easy explanations. What made it even harder to understand was the couple's situation. Both Bobby and Sherilyn were on disability. Bobby from severe back pain after a 2003 accident. Sherilyn from documented struggles with bipolar disorder and recurring depression. They weren't buying land casually. Money was always tight. Yet here was a sealed envelope stuffed with tens of thousands of dollars left untouched in the vehicle. The discovery unsettled investigators from the start, because it ran against everything they knew about the Jamesons' circumstances. And then there was Bobby's cell phone. Among the data stored on it was a single photograph of little Madison in the woods, near where the truck had been found. She appears still, unsmiling, in an image that seemed to carry a strange weight once the family disappeared. Nobody can say why the picture was taken, or by whom. But knowing this was one of the final moments captured before the family vanished made it a disturbing piece of evidence. Searchers also turned up an 11-page handwritten letter by Sherilyn inside the vehicle. Investigators described it as angry in tone, suggesting marital conflict. It was not proof on its own, but enough to make authorities consider whether stress or arguments inside the home might have played a role. To outsiders, the Jamesons seemed like a family trying to escape their burdens by moving into isolation. That letter raised the uncomfortable question of whether those burdens had already fractured life behind closed doors. Still, the vehicle didn't look like the backdrop to a domestic fight that spiraled out of control. And it didn't fit the pattern of a planned disappearance. IDs, wallets, coats, phones, the GPS. All of it had been left as though time had frozen the moment the doors were shut. Investigators could only conclude they were missing, but missing in a way that left no logical narrative to follow. Standing beside that locked pickup in the woods, officers and volunteers read the scene like a riddle that refused to solve itself. Everything personal was still there. Everything essential was still within reach. Yet the Jamesons were gone. It was that discovery which set off the next stage. The frantic attempt to comb the wilderness for any trace of the family. And while the truck gave investigators plenty of odd clues, what came next was somehow even stranger. A massive search effort across miles of rugged forest that returned absolutely nothing. The discovery of the Jamesons' truck immediately triggered a massive search operation through the mountains. Over the following days, between 300 and 400 people, volunteers, law enforcement, fire crews, and trained search teams spread out in every direction from that dirt road. Cadaver dogs sniffed through brush and ravines. ATVs and horses carried searchers deep into places vehicles normally couldn't go. Helicopters circled overhead with spotlights and thermal imaging equipment sweeping the trees. From the outside, it looked organized, almost surgical. Yet despite all that effort, not a single thread of the family's trail appeared. Those on the ground were fighting against punishing conditions. The Sans Bois Mountains are choked with thick trees, steep ravines, and sudden drops. Trails vanish into thickets or dead ends without warning. Moving beyond a few hundred feet from a path became dangerous. But searchers still pushed every direction they could around that truck, expecting at least a footprint, a jacket, a single object left behind. Instead, the landscape gave them nothing. No prints, no clothing, no signs of recent passage at all. It created the unnerving impression that 3 people had walked off and simply ceased to exist in the woods. One of the strangest moments from the early search came when cadaver dogs picked up on something near a water tower in the area. The scent was strong enough that investigators ordered the entire tower drained, an expensive and time-consuming task. When it was emptied, the result stunned them. Nothing. No bones. No trace of human remains at all. It was a false lead, but it sat in the investigators' minds as one more thing about this disappearance that refused to make sense. As police dug deeper into the background, they reviewed security camera footage from outside the Jameson home before the trip. In the video, Bobby and Sherilyn made multiple trips back and forth between the house and their truck. They weren't speaking. They weren't reacting to one another. Instead, they moved stiffly, placing items in the truck almost like they were sleepwalking. No argument, no obvious purpose outside of just carrying things back and forth. Investigators who studied the footage admitted it didn't give them answers. It only reinforced the unease. Something already seemed off before the Jamesons even left their driveway. Then came a detail that defied logic. On November 12th, 2009, over a month after the family was last seen, an outgoing call was made to Bobby Jameson's voicemail. The problem was that Bobby's phone had been sitting inside the locked truck the entire time. It hadn't gone anywhere. Investigators had to ask themselves, who tried to check his voicemail? Was someone else in possession of the phone before leaving it in the pickup again? Or was it the family briefly accessing it before vanishing? Even though it appears to have been just one attempt, that single call kept the worst possibilities wide open. Through those weeks, searchers kept sweeping the forest, hoping something would surface. They turned over the same trails, canvassed ravines, and circled back to areas that had already been covered. Cadaver dogs returned more than once to check for any change in scent. Helicopters brought heat-seeking technology into the air. Each step was meant to ensure nothing slipped by unnoticed. But nothing ever did turn up. Not a shoe, not a toy, not a shred of fabric. Zero evidence came out of a huge, coordinated effort. With time passing and no physical evidence to work from, investigators began facing pressure to explain the case in other ways. Some in the community speculated the Jamesons had staged their own disappearance, maybe using that money to start a new life somewhere else. But the theory broke down quickly. Why would they abandon $32,000 in cash beneath the truck seat? Why leave IDs, wallets, coats, and their daughter's toys behind? And perhaps most damning of all, why would they doom their dog to starve inside a locked vehicle? If it was a plan, it was completely irrational. Nothing about it suggested a voluntary exit. Law enforcement ran through more possibilities. Could a local group, a cult even, have targeted them? Rumors swirled in the area. Drugs were floated as another explanation. Investigators even looked at family conflict as a potential motive. But with no evidence in their hands, everything stayed hypothetical. Every theory pulled attention in a different direction, and none could be backed by proof. The case settled into an uneasy limbo, where law enforcement admitted they had too many unanswered questions and too few solid leads. Eventually, the vast, coordinated search wound down. The helicopters returned to their bases, the dogs went back to their kennels, and the volunteers stopped arriving each morning. The Jameson truck stood as the only physical anchor point in the whole case. Locked, full of personal belongings, but surrounded by emptiness. All anyone could say was that the family had somehow left that area. But to where and why, nobody could prove. Pause and think. If you saw that truck sitting alone in the woods, packed with money, IDs, and a child's toys, what would you assume happened? For years, that was the only image investigators had. A vehicle in the forest with no family in sight. And then, almost 4 years later, a group of hunters in the same wilderness came across something that would finally break the silence. In November 2013, the case took a grim turn. On the 16th, hunters moving through a remote part of the Sans Bois Mountains called Smokestack Hollow found something scattered across the forest floor. Partial skeletal remains. At first, the bones could have belonged to anyone. But over time, testing made the truth undeniable. They belonged to 2 adults and 1 child. Even more haunting was the location, only about 2.7 miles from where the Jamisons' truck had been discovered 4 years earlier. The remains were in poor condition. Years of exposure to heat, rain, and wildlife had weathered the bones and scattered them under leaves and brush. According to the Oklahoma State Medical Examiner, animal predation had occurred, and decomposition had erased nearly every trace of evidence that could help explain what had happened. The cause and manner of death were ultimately listed as undetermined. For investigators and family alike, undetermined meant the long-awaited discovery was not a resolution at all, just another heavy layer of uncertainty. Adding to the frustration, teams had intensely scoured these mountains in 2009 with helicopters, cadaver dogs, and hundreds of searchers. People had passed through Smokestack Hollow more than once, yet the Jamisons' remains had somehow gone undiscovered. Search experts later suggested dense brush, shifting ground cover, and steep terrain might have concealed the site. Still, it was inconceivable to many that 3 people had been lying just miles from the truck all that time. Even after the bones were found, immediate answers did not follow. Identification of the remains required months of lab analysis, and it wasn't until July 2014, over half a year after the hunters' discovery, that the state medical examiner officially confirmed they were Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. The delay reinforced just how difficult closing this case was becoming. There was, however, one detail in particular that quickly spread through news and rumor. Investigators noted a small hole in one of the skulls, reportedly Bobby's. At first glance, it raised an obvious possibility: a gunshot. But experts urged caution. Damage to bone in open terrain can come from many things: animal bites, environmental wear, even the pressure of soil. No bullet was recovered. Without ballistic evidence, investigators could not conclusively link the hole to a firearm. The possibility of a shooting lingered, but it could not be proven. That ambiguity tied back to another unresolved fact. A .22 caliber handgun belonging to Sherilyn was missing from the Jamison home and never recovered. Did it leave the house with them on October 8th? Could it have been connected to the remains in the woods? Officially, investigators had no way to know. Along with the gun, a brown briefcase seen in security footage of the family packing their truck was also never found. These gaps, the missing gun, the missing briefcase, remained sticking points in an investigation already drowning in unanswered questions. Rumors naturally filled the vacuum. Some argued this was murder-suicide, possibly stemming from mental health struggles or escalating conflict, pointing to Sherilyn's angry letter to Bobby. Others suspected drug involvement. Meth use and trafficking were known problems in the region, and the $32,000 envelope raised eyebrows. A few focused on whispers about cult activity in rural Oklahoma. Sherilyn's interest in spiritual topics fueled speculation for people who were looking for something darker at play. And of course, more sensational ideas crept in. The eerie surveillance footage of the couple moving robotically between house and truck prompted some to see unnatural influence. Officially, none of these theories could be proven. The skeletal remains gave presence without clarity, and the medical examiner's ruling of undetermined left the door open to almost every possibility. Some witnesses later claimed the skeletons were found lying face down, though official reports emphasized decomposition and animal activity made body position impossible to confirm. Even this detail showed how contested and confusing information became once the remains surfaced. Stripped of forensic evidence, investigators were left with speculation. Maybe the Jamisons died from exposure or hypothermia. Maybe an argument turned violent. Maybe someone led them off that road and into the woods deliberately. Or maybe the truth looks nothing like the theories we've heard. What haunted everyone involved was the simple fact that the family had been so close the whole time, and yet still beyond reach. Instead of giving closure, their discovery raised more questions than it answered. It was not the end of the mystery. It was its cruelest twist. And that's why, even with the bodies found, the case felt unfinished. The Jamisons were no longer missing, but the answers remained missing. What investigators could confirm in the end was stark. The Jamisons' remains were found in November 2013, officially identified in July 2014. But the medical examiner ruled the cause and manner of death undetermined. No weapon was recovered. No definitive evidence explained how or why this family died. That stayed as the central unresolved fact. This was not a puzzle on paper. It involved real people, with loved ones left grieving. Any theories deserve caution and respect. An ordinary family set out on an ordinary trip, and their story stopped in the woods with no clear ending. What do you think happened? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel for more cases like this.